I've known Mark Fisher since my son, who's now 23, was 5. Both of our youngest children went to school together, so I've known him longer than he was legislating. I know how he makes gingerbread houses and pretty much everything there is to know that a family can know about another family. He is a very dear man with a lovely family, really in Calvert County, Southern Maryland. He's trying to do the right thing. He has his own business. But I want to give you a little flavor for what this man is really about when it comes to doing his job here in Annapolis. We sent out an invitation to all of the legislators to join us here today, whether online or in person. We have sent out about 75, no, not we, you all have sent out about 7,500 communications to legislators in Annapolis over the last 3 weeks. We've also sent out individual packages to each legislator over the last couple of weeks. This is a grassroots organization. This is what we do at night on the weekends. And so I believe that our call to action for you all here and the rest of the constituents in Maryland that have supported this resolution have really come off the charts and communicated your voice in Annapolis. So between 5,000 and 7,500 emails, phone calls, and text messages has been delivered to Annapolis in the last couple of weeks. You have been heard. And when we sent out the invitation to legislators to join us here, we knew it was going to be difficult because of the restrictions in gatherings. But there are very few that actually RSVP'd to be here today. When this was sent out last week, the first response that we received was from the Senator Ferguson's office, from his chief of staff. And he wrote to Steve Patton and said, "I received your invite from 2 members of the Senate and am writing to urge you to cancel. In the midst of a pandemic, we have actively discouraged members and staff from attending any events and are not hosting events off campus. We will be actively discouraging senators and staff from attending this and all other events in the interest of public health. It does no good for your organization to be known as the one organization that is ignoring public health and hosting a dangerous event in the middle of COVID-19. Please note that while this is the only event I have seen in Annapolis to date, this has been a consistent message throughout session in our efforts to keep members and staff safe. I look forward to your reply. Jake." And Mark wrote back, "Dear Yakov, thank you for your email concerning the Convention of States Action Day in Annapolis. Your comments below remind me of the infamous Committee on Public Safety, run by Maximilien Robespierre during the French Revolution. The Committee on Public Safety, as it's euphemistically known, purged anyone who posed a, quote, safety threat to the new order in France. Robespierre simply used the guillotine to silence all violators of public safety. Your email reminds me of this hysteria, albeit without the guillotine. Quote, obey or you will be canceled. The Convention of States Action Day participants are smart enough to follow common sense guidance from the Health Department and from the CDC. They don't require virtue signaling and silly fear-mongering from a wannabe Robespierre. To that end, the event will continue as scheduled. I look forward to your reply. Sincerely, Delegate Mark N. Fisher." So we are the only event that's been here in Annapolis in about a year. And I think it's just a grace thing. So like I said, Mark is member of the Tri-County Southern Maryland region. His real job is communications towers. He's the managing member of Telecom Capital Group. He does have a real job. Economic Matters Committee, PNC, which is insurance speak. That's kind of what I know. Committees, utilities, business regulation, and the House Chair of the Calvert County Delegation. Mark is a Baltimore native and a graduate of George Washington University. He does lots of volunteer work in his spare time. Between his wife and his children, who's very involved in Southern Maryland political party issues. I met Mark again from the Calverton School. He was on the board of directors in 2003. He is really highly involved in mentoring youth to adults in business matters, coaching sports, renovating this wonderful sports field down in Southern Maryland where we live. Working with people that are below the poverty line, that are having difficulty in their lives. You know, you may not know this, but when you are elected as official in Maryland, you get calls from everybody wanting to get your trash collected quicker, to helping you figure out how to bury a loved one, to writing letters to anybody, to utilities issues, to I hate my grocer. I mean, every possible thing that you can think of, these people have to deal with on a daily basis. It used to be 3 months in session, and then they could go about their lives and be a delegate, but it wasn't a full-time job. I think since the pandemic, it's become more than a full-time job, and many of these legislators have had to double or triple their volunteer staff just to keep communicating and do these things virtually. I think on average, they might have 6 to 7 Zoom calls a day from legislators and their fellow elected officials. To me, that's just astonishing. We all have Zoom fatigue, and I just can't say enough about the work that these people do. And I don't think we give them enough credit, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on. This is a tough job, trying to make everybody happy. And it's kind of a thankless job, because when things are going well, they don't hear from you at all, but things are going well because they're doing their job. One last thing I'll say about Mark is he has a very successful podcast called Mark and the Millennials, which you can access through any of your podcast. I don't know all of the proper names for that. I'm sure that Mark will tell you. But you should download it and listen to it. It's funny. It's informative. It's a little, I don't want to say. It's interesting. Let's just say he has an interesting take. He's unafraid and unashamed to talk about issues that matter to you. Capitalism, free speech, free commerce. This is what Mark is all about. Loving his family and protecting families in Calvert County. I just couldn't be more honored to be his friend. And I'm going to cry. No. No, I'm not. But here's Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, C. So thank you, everybody, for having me at COS. Especially I want to thank C. Harrison and Stephen Patton, who run this great organization, and all of the volunteers here in the state of Maryland who, and believe me, they are volunteers who run this great organization to try to bring our country back to a constitutional republic, which is what really this organization is all about. So I was just looking online, and one of the areas of my background in education is economics, right? Guess what? Our GDP in the United States of America now, and our debt to GDP now exceeds 100%. You know what that means? It means we owe more money than our entire gross national product. And we have let that happen. We, the people, have let that happen. We've let that happen at the federal level because the federal government, of course, uses its spending leverage to coerce states into accepting new laws and new monies. And in order to be able to get that money, you have to accept, of course, the concept of more spending thereafter. So there's no greater example than, of course, public education, right? K-12 education. In Maryland, for the most part, children are still learning from home. And yet, of course, everybody, including the CDC, the director of the CDC, and including Dr. Fauci himself, believes that people should be back in the classroom. Yet, what do we see happening? We see so many individuals who are suffering because they're not back in the classroom because of why? Big government, right? We have a top-down mentality for public education in this state, but also at the federal level too, where the federal government is actually telling our children what they should be learning in the classroom, rather than having a parent-driven and a child-driven model. And that's exactly what we need in this country, of course. But don't just look at the federal debt. Look at, and of course, is a huge issue for COS, which I'm just a huge fan of this, and that is term limits. What better example, if you live in the state of Maryland, than to look at Congressman Steny Hoyer? He's the House Majority Leader. And he is what? He's been in office for more than 50 years. For more than 50 years. He actually started in office right here in Annapolis at the Maryland State Senate. He was State Senate President, and then he moved on to Congress, and he moved up into leadership. But he's been in office now cumulatively for more than 50 years. The man is 81 years old. I don't disparage people who are still in the workforce when they're older. I actually think that's great. But the founding fathers didn't have an idea that this would be a full-time job and it would be a full-time career. The idea was this would not be a full-time job and it would not be a career, that you would go into government and you would serve for a couple of terms and you would learn about what needs to be learned and help with your unique experiences from your work back home that you did. You bring that to government, and then what would you do? You would then move to the next job in government, or you would go back home and let the next person come in, but not anymore. Not anymore, because there's way too much money in government. Because look, Joe Biden is a great example. I'm not going to just pick on Democrats. I'm going to pick on Republicans too. How is it possible? How is it possible that an elected official goes into Congress as a middle-class person, and then 25, 30 years later, they're millionaires? It's just not possible, and it doesn't look right, and it doesn't feel right. We see that with the current president of the United States. He has multiple houses. He's been in office now. My understanding is, I think it's close to 50 years, thereabouts. I mean, you can look it up, including his time in the Senate, and also his 8 years as vice president of the United States, and now president of the United States. But you can also see the same thing on the Republican side. You can see, there were a couple of senators in Georgia, and they lost their races. And quite frankly, when I looked at them, months ago, I knew they were going to lose their races, the two Republicans, because they were trading on inside information. They were trading on inside information with Wall Street. And of course, they went in front of everybody and said, oh, no, we didn't do that. But I'm convinced that's why they lost. And they should have lost because of it. And there are so few of us who are willing to stand up and talk about these fundamental issues of government, about how it has just gotten so big, so out of control, how people are enriching themselves. I mean, Bill and Hillary Clinton, right? How did Bill and Hillary Clinton from Arkansas translate their jobs in Arkansas to now a fortune in the neighborhood of $250 to $500 million, thereabouts? And that's very accurate, by the way. How did that happen? How did we, the people, let that happen? And this organization, COS is here as the pioneer in the United States organization to bring this country back to a constitutional republic, to impose term limits, to stop the federal overreach, among many other things. So let me give you a great example of federal overreach. Right now, in the United States of America, if you want to invest in renewable energy, the only reason why you would probably do it is because there are these massive federal tax breaks that are in place. In other words, you can use your money that you made from last year that you would normally be paying taxes on and invested it in renewable energy. And you know what ends up happening? You don't pay taxes. So why does that matter? It matters because if you watch the news in the last 24 hours, you'll see how the federal government has entirely messed up the energy sector by encouraging people to invest their money, which you might say is taxpayer money, but it's guaranteed by the federal government because you're foregoing taxes, into things like wind turbines in Texas, which did what? They just froze up. They just froze up. And Texas has 25% of their electricity on the grid from wind turbines. That investment would never have been made but for the federal government coercing Wall Street and so many other wealthy investors to invest in this tax shelter known as wind turbines that now have left some people dead in Texas because they don't have heat. We don't need the federal government to tell us what kind of heat and what kind of cooling and what kind of electricity that we want to buy. We just want, for me, when I turn that switch on, I just want it to work, right? I mean, that's enough for me. But if you want to talk about clean energy, well, then let's let the market decide. Nuclear energy is clean energy. It produces no CO2 emissions whatsoever. But the federal government doesn't want to do that. Instead, it's all about this shell game where you enrich your donors. And those donors, of course, on one side would be the donors who profit from solar farms and from wind farms. And I'm sure if you saw the news recently, and I'm actually on this committee that deals with the subject matter. So of course, thousands and thousands of migratory birds are killed every year by wind turbines. And then we see the fact that the grid was shut down in Texas, right now. Now think about this, ladies and gentlemen, COS. We are the richest country on planet Earth. Texas is one of the most abundant states for energy on planet Earth. And yet its grid failed because of the federal government basically making it impossible for people to make rational decisions at the local level and the state level to keep the people safe. And that is the fundamental job of the federal government, is to keep us safe, right? To have a military to keep us safe from foreign powers, but of course, foreign enemies, both domestic and foreign. But in addition to that, of course, basic services like utilities to make sure that they function properly. And that is, to me, there's no greater example than that most recent example of the Texas grid failing in one of the nation's most richest oil and natural gas fields, not to mention one of the richest and most abundant in the world. And so here's what's interesting. Texas is run by Republicans, right? They let that happen. So this is not necessarily, as I've said before, and Stephen said this to me many times, and he's so right, Stephen Patton, this is not just a Democrat or Republican thing, right? You got Republicans who are buying into this stuff, this renewable energy, federal government coercion stuff. And what are they doing? They're buying into it in Texas, and they've wrecked the grid. So now they're going to be spending years, these Republicans who run Texas, Republicans control the legislature in Texas, they control the governor's house in Texas, and yet they let this happen. And they have controlled it for many years. So we see this on both sides. Without question, we see this on both sides. And we also want to make sure that federalism is restored to our Constitution. You know, the idea that the states are supreme in the United States, and that the local governments and the state governments tell us and allow the people to tell them what we want done. Let me just give a great example of this, right? Right now, there's a bill in Congress. It's the latest stimulus bill that has not yet passed, that Joe Biden wants passed, and it has in it, among other things, $350 billion of unrestricted money for states. In other words, it would be a transfer from all taxpayers nationwide to states based on their populations. And guess which states have high populations and completely and utterly mismanage their budgets? The blue states, New York, California, Illinois. So President Biden wants $350 billion to be transferred to the states, the 50 states, but disproportionately to those states that have been mismanaging their budgets. And all it's going to do is encourage them to continue to do more of that. And we wonder why debt to GDP is at 100% plus, because we're just allowing this to happen. So that's just at the federal level. And then, of course, federalism naturally is the whole idea that when you don't like the state that you're living in, you have an opportunity to move to another state. So think about that, right? So right now, of course, one of the hot states to move to, probably, literally hot, as well as figuratively, would be Florida. I mean, who wouldn't want to move to Florida right now? Because if you live in a high-tax state, or if you live in a state that's shut down, of course, because you have a lockdown governor, then you might really seriously consider going to a state that is a free state. One such free state would be Florida. Another, of course, is Texas, although, of course, Texas have naturally just got this incredibly bad news about the grid being shut down. So it does make you wonder, about how brilliant these leaders are in these states. But the fact of the matter is we have 50 state incubators. That is what the founding fathers wanted us to understand. 50 incubators. We have incubators. We go to those incubators and we say, you know what? I don't like New York State because their governor was such an idiot that he put COVID patients in with the nursing home patients and literally committed, I don't know. I mean, to me, it looks like he killed a bunch of people in New York State. And if it were me and I'm getting older, I'd think to myself, you know what? I might want to leave New York State and go to another state. But that is not what the federal officials want. Increasingly, both Republicans and Democrats at the federal level want the United States to be uniform. They want all the states to be the same. They want there to be a uniform wage in all the states. They don't want differences. They don't want any kind of unique qualities of individual states. And that, of course, is antithetical to federalism, which is what the founding fathers wanted. I don't want to go to Alabama and find that it's going to be exactly like the state of Maryland. And I don't want to go to Florida and find out that it's exactly like the state of New York. I want this richness and diversity of the unique states and the way they are run by their local governments. But increasingly, of course, the federal government is using money as leverage, of course, to get people to adopt all this bad stuff. And I just want to cover this now too, and that is, if you want any better example, then look at what governments have done in overstepping with COVID. There's no better example, right? So we, the people, have given power to governments at state levels and at the federal level to rule us about, including lockdowns, and telling us we can't go to work. And, you know, I was thinking about this the other day with my good friend Dan Cox, who is a Maryland state delegate from Western Maryland. And I was talking to him the other day and I said, you know what our big mistake is? And I'll speak for myself as someone who's a conservative. Our big mistake is that we have allowed government to tell us who is essential. How dare us allow government to tell us who is essential and who isn't? Because everybody is essential. And during a pandemic, everybody is essential in government. The second government convinces you that you're not essential is the second government rules you and you fear government. And that is exactly what has happened. And we, the people, have let that happen. We have. And so here we are a year into the pandemic, and we still have lockdowns, including in Maryland. I mean, you can't even go to some restaurants. And here's my thing, right? In a free society where information truly is shared freely, you can make up your own mind as to whether or not you want to go into a restaurant during a pandemic based on your own unique health circumstances. And you make up your mind yourself, right? You decide. And if you're someone who is ill and you are very elderly or you have comorbidities, then you probably want to stay home. In a free society, you get to decide. Government doesn't get to decide for you, but we've allowed that to happen. And in this state, we have lockdown Larry Hogan, who of course just thinks it's okay. You know, and by the way, guys, I'm a Republican, right? And I think he's lockdown Larry. I mean, it's locking down schools. I mean, the only reason why Governor Hogan came forward and said schools should be open recently is because of the simple fact that he's reading the polls, right? He's reading the polls. But look how Florida did it with the schools. So listen, you know how Florida has, since September of last year, Florida has said to parents, if you want to send your children to school full time, 5 days a week, and you want them to participate in sports, you can. If you want your child to stay home and learn via Zoom, you can. It's up to you, mom and dad. But if your child is learning at home from Zoom, just remember that that is an inferior way to learn, and you, the parents, are going to take responsibility for that, not the public school system. So it gives people educational freedom to decide for themselves versus what Maryland has done, which is to listen to, of course, certain groups and to lock down. And now people are even saying, well, you know, the Biden administration recently said through Jen Psaki, they said, well, when are schools going to open? And Jen Psaki said, well, President Biden said the schools will open, you know, like over the next 100 days. Well, in 100 days, we're going to be in summer break. And we're going to have people who are juniors and seniors who like literally lost the last 2 years of high school. And I'm sure that by midsummer, we're going to find more people who are going to find reasons not to send people back to school. But we have allowed this to happen. That's why COS is so important. COS is so important because we realize that we are living in post-constitutional times. Post-constitutional times, where we have two parties at the federal level and many in the state level too, quite frankly, who do not believe in the Constitution of the United States. They do not want to follow it. They want to eliminate the Second Amendment. And of course, they also don't really necessarily believe in the First Amendment, because has anyone stood up really, except for a few people, about big tech and the First Amendment and what big tech is doing to us, we the people, and we've allowed that to happen? So there are so many areas that COS is attacking, and it's a growing organization. And I'm so proud that it's a growing organization, especially in this state. So let's hear it. You should all clap for yourselves out there. I'm just saying. And so I just want to thank everybody for having me. I just want you to know, when I got into government, I really thought that I would come to Annapolis, and of course I was very naive, and I thought, wow, it's going to be easy, right? It's going to be really easy to do the right thing. And it's really interesting because I will have colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, you know what, Mark, you know what, you always vote red. Like, you know, red means I'm voting against something. I'm like, yeah, but for me, my idea of government is a limited government, right? A government that is truly limited. And if I really believe that, then that is the way I'm going to vote. And that is the way I vote. So proof in point. On our podcast, Mark and the Millennials, so I'm going to do the shameless plug. Please. On Mark and the Millennials, our podcast, which is free, of course, it always will be free on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, et cetera, we have occasionally what we call the dumbest bill in America. It's a series. And in the dumbest bill of America, we choose a bill from a state legislature or a city council or the federal government. And we essentially talk about the bill and talk about how stupid it is and how unnecessary it is, because that is what's happening. We have the federal and state and local governments that are trying to micromanage every aspect of human life by passing bills. And if that's really what you believe, if you really believe that you feel safer because government is passing a bill, or executive orders, right? Talk about overreaching, the executive orders, right? I mean, by the way, wasn't that a king? Isn't that what kings did? They were called decrees, right? I signed this decree. It's an executive order. And by the way, Trump did it too, and Biden did it as well. So it's on both sides. But on our Dumbest Bill in America series, we talk about a really stupid bill that's somewhere in America. And I'll give you an example. There's a state senator in Illinois. Her name's Laura Fine. And Laura Fine put a bill in to ban leaf blowers, right? So she doesn't like leaf blowers. So look, you might not like leaf blowers either. But can you imagine running for state senate in the state of Illinois, and you're like, you know what my priority is this year? I'm going to ban leaf blowers. It's so ridiculous, right? We also have a city councilwoman in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who last year passed a bill to ban drive-thrus. So she literally banned drive-thrus. Now, of course, if you've ever been to Minneapolis, Minnesota, you realize it's really cold there. So people like drive-thrus because when it's winter, like 8 months a year there, you're really cold and you don't necessarily want to get out of your car and go inside. So these are just a couple of silly examples. We have a Republican here in Maryland who passed a bill. You guys will love this. He passed a bill to make it a fine. Initially, it was a criminal fine. To release balloons with helium, to release balloons. Think about that, right? So my government is micromanaging. I mean, can you imagine? What did you do this year, state delegate? Oh, I passed a bill to make it illegal to release balloons. So now we're going to hire the balloon police and go around and write tickets out to everybody. So this is the kind of nonsense. And by the way, this is a colleague on my side of the aisle. This is the kind of nonsense that these people are doing. They're trying to micromanage every aspect of human life. And when you do that, the first thing that should come to your mind is, hey, the founding fathers wanted limited government. They don't want you telling us whether or not we can release balloons. I mean, we can kind of figure that out, right? I think that, you know, it's not really hard. And they don't want to tell us that we can or can't use, I don't know, leaf blowers. I mean, what is another one? Huh? Yeah, the exit tax. So you like this. So California is one of my favorites, by the way. So the state of California, of course, which is a dystopian nightmare in every way imaginable, is in such a money-grabbing mood that they have a bill that was introduced by this guy who's an assemblyman, I think is Assemblyman Bonta. And Assemblyman Bonta in California put a bill in to make you pay an exit tax if you left the state of California. So can you imagine, right? So you leave California, and what his bill says is when you move from California to Texas, you still have to pay an income tax to California for 10 years, even after you've left. Now, obviously, that is unconstitutional. But what does that tell you about the mentality of elected officials who put those kinds of bills in? What does that tell you? The mentality is that they think that they should control every human aspect of life, and they try to justify their existence in public office by passing such bills. And guess what? More often than not, they succeed. And we realize that we are less free tomorrow than we were today as a result of it. And I've said it every time we in Annapolis that we're here. When the state legislature meets for 90 days, you are not safe. Freedom is not safe. The Bill of Rights is not safe. The Constitution is not safe. And so I just want to thank all of the COS people. I want to thank Stephen Patton. I want to thank C. Harrison. I want to thank all the volunteers for being here. And I would be more than happy to take questions. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Fisher. Thank you very much. Delegate Fisher is a true champion of the COS cause here in Maryland. Thank you very much, Mark.
Absolutely.
Thank you for everything you do for us. Thank you for everything you do to us. I'd like to